The sun shone on Metropolitan Central. In the quiet corridor, Leo Mason, a single father in biomed tech, stood before Director Elias Thorne. Thorne, in his dark suit, coldly signed the termination papers for protocol violation. His voice cut through the quiet. "You are done here, Mr. Mason?" Leo placed his badge on the desk and walked toward the exit. That's when the distant, deep thrumming began, the unmistakable sound of rotary blades. The glass walls of the atrium started to vibrate with a low, unnerving frequency. Staff rushed to the windows as a dark gray Navy helicopter started its descent onto the rooftop helipad. Leo Mason was the quiet ghost in the machine of the prestigious hospital. In his late 30s, his official title was Biomedical Technician and Emergency Logistics Coordinator, a job that should have kept him strictly in the back rooms, managing inventory and calibrating machines. But Leo wasn't just a tech. He was a single father, a man who traded the volatile glory of his past for the rigid, predictable routine that his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, desperately needed. Leo's history was the hospital's dirty secret. He was a former major, an elite combat medic who spent nearly a decade in forward operating bases, places where the dust never settled and the margin for error was measured in heartbeats. He lived in a world where the only protocol that mattered was the one that kept a pulse beating, often using a wrench and duct tape as much as a scalpel. He had mastered the art of triage under fire, but that life had cost him his peace. He left the military, choosing the sterile, civilian environment of Metropolitan Central to achieve domestic peace. He believed that fixing complex equipment was safer than fixing complex wounds. His civilian work was a fortress of reliability, a promise to Lily, who required a fixed schedule due to her high-functioning autism. Any emotional turbulence, any unexpected financial or logistical hurdle could trigger a debilitating sensory overload for her. Leo's salary, though modest, was guaranteed, and his routine was immutable. He was fixing machines, but he was truly safeguarding his daughter's stability. However, the rigid civilian bureaucracy of the hospital was an administrative fortress, completely divorced from the battlefield chaos Leo understood. The hospital operated on a principle of defensive medicine: prioritize audit trails and liability control over risky, non-standard intervention. This was the fundamental conflict. Leo was notorious for excessive intervention, for overriding slow-moving, cautious protocols when he saw the immediate risk of death. His gut, honed by split-second triage under fire, was a far more accurate diagnostic tool than any computerized system the hospital owned. He was a man who saw the patient, not the chart. The conflict climaxed just yesterday. A major trauma case, a construction accident involving complex crush injuries, arrived. The attending physician, Dr. Julian, a rising star who followed the hospital handbook religiously, hesitated. He was waiting for the certified surgical consult to arrive before initiating a non-standard procedure that carried legal risk. The patient was minutes from cardiac arrest due to an obscure arterial tear hidden by massive internal swelling. Time was not a luxury they possessed. Without a single word of permission, Leo, observing from his technical station, grabbed a specialized field kit he kept locked away, a non-approved military-grade suture and stabilization set. He bypassed the administrative chain of command for emergency blood sourcing, utilizing an unlogged reserve, and performed a makeshift but life-saving, on-the-spot vascular repair. The patient lived, pulled back from the brink by sheer audacity and skill, but the official report was an administrative horror show. Unapproved equipment, unlogged blood usage, and intervention by an uncertified technician. Director Elias Thorne, the hospital's CEO, was obsessed with two things: maintaining the hospital's 5-star accreditation and curating a flawless media image. Thorne wasn't cruel, he was a pure systems man. The successful procedure was messy, non-standard, and created a mountain of liability in the audit trail. The cost of one unlogged procedure, in Thorne's mind, jeopardized the hospital's multi-million-dollar regulatory standing. Thorne chose to discipline Leo not because of incompetence, but because of his competence outside the lines. Your effectiveness is a liability, Mr. Mason, Thorne had told him minutes before. This is a civilized facility. We prioritize adherence to the paper trail above all else. A perfect chart is a perfect defense. Leo always carried a small, worn, leather-bound military checklist in his pocket. It wasn't for reference. It was a physical talisman, a silent reminder of the life he chose to leave behind, and the only code of conduct he truly trusted. Act first, document later. Never compromise the core mission. No one in the hospital's gleaming corridors, especially Director Thorne, conceived that the dismissal of a low-level tech could trigger an immediate, seismic consequence. They assumed Leo would quietly vanish back to his predictable life. But as the sound of the approaching aircraft grew, Leo, still standing by the elevator bank, adjusting the strap on his modest canvas tool bag, felt the familiar, cold pressure of urgency. The rotors were routine, yet something about the deep, resonant vibration felt different, more authoritative, less civilian. Director Thorne, meanwhile, stood by his pristine office window, adjusting his tie, feeling a satisfying rush of control. He had eliminated the unpredictability. The hospital was safe, administratively safe. He didn't realize the crisis was literally descending from the sky, and the only man who could handle it was walking out the front door. The distant, powerful thumping of the helicopter grew louder, faster, closer, shaking the very foundation of Thorne's carefully constructed world. The moment Leo reached the hospital's main lobby, preparing to step outside, the central radio system exploded with a deafening, urgent blast. Code Black! Trauma Bay 1! Code Black! The urgency in the coordinator's voice was raw, edged with pure panic, a sound that instantly cut through the bureaucratic calm. The call was immediately upgraded and clarified with a designation that froze the civilian staff. Priority 1. Military access required. Patient is designated Code Atlas. Secure the perimeter. Repeat, Code Atlas. This level of military clearance was unprecedented. It meant the incoming patient was not just a person, but a highly classified national security asset. A patient whose existence and injuries could not be documented on standard civilian forms. The patient, a high-ranking naval officer, had sustained severe, complex injuries during a covert mission rehearsal. The trauma profile was terrifying. Hyper-localized explosive shrapnel deep within the chest cavity, combined with a rare, pressure-related systemic trauma only seen in deep-sea or high-altitude military incidents. These were textbook battlefield wounds, entirely outside the scope of civilian medical training and experience. The metal fragments were of a non-ferrous, specialized alloy that civilian MRI could not safely detect, and the pressure trauma demanded a level of circulatory stabilization that conventional bypass machines were not calibrated to handle. In Trauma Bay 1, the civilian team, led by Dr. Julian, was utterly paralyzed. Their advanced, state-of-the-art equipment and standardized protocols were useless against this unique, classified profile of injury. They were trained for domestic incidents. This was an act of war on a molecular level. Julian found himself staring helplessly at the vitals display, his own sophisticated checklists useless. He realized his expertise, so celebrated in the civilian world, was shallow compared to the primal, necessary skill required now. Director Thorne, hearing the word military and Code Atlas, immediately went into damage control mode. His first thought was a massive PR disaster, the confidentiality breach, the paperwork nightmare, the accreditation hit. Thorne, watching the meltdown, wasn't just worried about media. He was horrified that his system, his beautiful, predictable system, was generating noise instead of solutions. He saw Julian, the product of his meticulous training, freeze. The director's commitment to the process was so profound that he couldn't recognize a catastrophic input failure. He muttered to himself, clutching his phone, "This is not how we operate. This is disorganized. We must regain control." The irony was that control was exactly what he had lost the moment he prioritized the audit trail over Mason's life-saving disruption. The sirens outside were now blending with the intensifying turbine whine from above, creating a symphony of system failure. His indecision wasted critical, golden time. Every second of delay exponentially increased the patient's chance of death. Frantically, Julian looked around the trauma bay, the scene descending into desperate chaos. A sudden, terrible realization hit him. This case required exactly the kind of improvised, deep knowledge battlefield medicine Leo Mason specialized in, the non-standard, aggressive, and highly effective techniques documented in military field manuals, not civilian textbooks. Julian slammed his fist on the counter. "Where's Mason? Get Mason in here. He has the equipment knowledge for this trauma profile, the blast trauma protocols. He knows the non-standard field stabilization techniques." A senior nurse grimly responded, the shame evident in her voice. "He was fired 10 minutes ago, doctor. Director Thorne signed the papers. He's probably already left the building." Julian rushed to the director's office, begging him to override the termination. "Director, we are losing him. This is Major Mason's area. Protocol is irrelevant. He's the only one who knows the field stabilization for this specific trauma type." Thorne, his face a rigid mask of hubris, refused, clinging to his administrative authority like a life raft. "We will adhere to standard operating procedure. We have licensed personnel who understand our rules. I will not recall a security liability simply because of a moment of panic, Julian. This is about institutional integrity." He doubled down, his principles costing valuable seconds and amplifying the patient's immediate danger. The civilian team was visibly failing. The vitals plummeted violently, triggering loud, continuous alarms. The hospital descended into true, unrestrained chaos, far worse than the orderly, documentable crisis Thorne preferred. Outside, the thrumming sound intensified into a deafening roar. It was no longer distant. It was immediately overhead, a physical, visceral presence. The light in the atrium flickered violently. Dust rained down from the ceiling vents. The sound was a powerful, rapidly descending pressure, a presence demanding entry, utterly impervious to civilian rules. Thorne, looking out his window, saw the massive dark silhouette of a Navy medevac helicopter. It wasn't hovering. It was landing with brutal, non-negotiable authority directly on the roof pad. The whole building groaned under the weight and the violent downwash, shaking the entire hospital structure. Thorne realized the patient was far more than a media risk. He was a national priority. His administrative nightmare had just become a military incursion, and the fate of a highly valuable asset rested on the hands of the man he had just banished. The irony was suffocating. The noise ceased abruptly, the profound, chilling silence punctuated only by the frantic alarms from the trauma bay. Then, the heavily reinforced steel door to the roof access burst open. A figure of absolute authority, Commander Riley, a heavily armored Navy officer, strode into the corridor, flanked by two stone-faced Marines. Riley's demeanor was absolute authority, his attention laser-focused, ignoring Thorne, who was frantically stammering an introduction. Commander Riley went straight to Trauma Bay 1. He took one look at the patient and the civilian team's floundering efforts, his expression one of icy contempt. He ignored Dr. Julian's desperate explanation of the failed protocol and instead pointed to the patient's existing, stabilized wound from the previous day. The deep, curved suture line on the forearm, the one Leo had fixed. "Who performed this vascular repair? Identify the technique used for this suture." His tone was a demand, not a question. Julian, stunned by the detail, mumbled, That was the tech, Mason. Leo Mason. He bypassed procedure yesterday." Thorne, now pale with horror, attempted to reassert control. "Commander, I assure you, Mr. Mason is no longer an employee. He was a low-level tech, a security risk due to protocol violations." Riley whirled on Thorne, his eyes cold steel, his voice dropping to a dangerous level of intensity that silenced the entire corridor. "He is low-level? Director, that suture pattern is a signature field technique, a modification Major Leo Mason invented on deployment in Kandahar. It's in every current medevac training module. That man, Director, is Major Leo Mason, retired. He is the preeminent expert in this exact trauma profile. He wrote the Forward Operating Base Tactical Triage Manual. And that patient you nearly killed with your protocol is Admiral Vance's chief of staff, a man whose neurological data is vital to a multi-billion-dollar project. He needs Major Mason's hands now. The revelation dropped like a tactical bomb. The hospital director had just fired the one man the entire U.S. Navy urgently required to save its classified asset. The gravity of Thorne's mistake was immense. It was not a liability of auditing, but a catastrophic failure of national security support. Riley didn't hesitate. He barked into his secure headset, his voice cutting through the panic. "Find Major Mason. Locate him now. He is the priority asset. Bring him back. No discussion. Use all necessary means." Leo, still waiting for the elevator in the lobby, was suddenly surrounded by a squad of frantic security guards who had transitioned from escorting him out to practically carrying him back toward the trauma center at a dead sprint. Commander Riley did not wait for Leo's return. He approached Thorne, who was visibly shaking, his facade of authority utterly shattered. "Director Thorne," Riley stated, his voice quiet but absolute, "I am invoking Directive 7, top-tier classified medical triage. This hospital is now a classified military medical zone. You are relieved of all operational command until this trauma is resolved. All existing hospital protocols are suspended." Thorne stammered, his mind racing through legal codes and administrative bylaws. "You cannot. My authority, my accreditation, the bylaws of the board." Riley's voice was iron, crushing all legal and administrative resistance. "Your authority ended when you prioritized paperwork over the life of a classified asset, Director. Your civilian rules endangered a national resource. You will observe from the perimeter. If you interfere with the Major's work, I will initiate disciplinary action through the Secretary of the Navy." Thorne was physically forced to yield control of his own medical facility to a naval commander. The entire civilian chain of command instantly collapsed, replaced by the rigid, efficient command structure of the military. The hospital's organizational chart was overwritten by a single determined officer. Leo, looking calm and utterly unfazed by the surrounding chaos, stepped back into the trauma bay, his worn scrub top a beacon of competence. He ignored the director entirely, focusing immediately on the patient. He simply looked at the flustered team. The uniform was the same, but the authority was now undeniable, backed by the presence of armed Marines in the hallway. He didn't run. He walked calmly, his eyes scanning the monitors, the patient, and the faces of the team. A rapid, silent triage of the environment. He immediately spotted Julian's biggest mistake, misreading the microfragmentation pattern. Leo's first command cut through the tension. "Doctor, Julian, stop the cardiac stimulant. Now. You're accelerating the fragmentation spread. We need systemic cooling and deep sedation. Prep the chest cavity for a dynamic pressure shunt. It's not a listed procedure, but it's the only way to counteract the barotrauma." Julian, stunned but trusting, immediately complied. The look on Julian's face transitioned from panic to sheer awe as Leo effortlessly managed two trauma types simultaneously. Leo issued rapid, precise orders in the clear military cadence that brooked no debate. "Julian, retractors, angle 5. Nurse, prep the advanced coagulant. My specifications, not the civilian standard. I need a clear field, fast. Dr. Julian, take the patient's left side. You know the anatomy. Everyone, follow my rhythm. No questions. Time starts now." The civilian team, seeing the Navy command structure, the commander's silent authority, and realizing their own helplessness, snapped to attention. They obeyed Leo's every command. Leo worked with a chilling, detached efficiency, speaking only in acronyms and measurements. 5 cc's, slow push, pressure drop stabilizing, time of entry, 3 minutes. He moved from the patient's chest to the fluid lines, bypassing the malfunctioning civilian pump and connecting his own, smaller, military-grade unit, which was specifically designed for rapid, precise infusion of non-standard blood products. Leo's hands moved with the surgical speed and confidence of a man operating under fire, prioritizing stabilization and extraction above sterile procedure. He isolated the secondary tear, bypassed the compromised vessels, and performed a complex stabilization technique Julian had only read about in obscure battlefield journals, a technique that bought the patient crucial hours. The patient was stabilized, the golden hour just barely salvaged. The chaos subsided, replaced by the hum of working equipment. Leo stepped back. The procedure was a quiet, resounding success. The entire power structure of Metropolitan Central Hospital had been completely inverted by a discharged major and a landing helicopter. Leo quietly began inspecting his trauma instruments, cleaning the last flecks of blood from the specialized field kit. Commander Riley approached Director Thorne, who stood isolated near the entrance, his dark suit suddenly looking rumpled and inadequate, the epitome of fallen administrative arrogance. Riley's voice was measured, but his words were devastating. "You nearly compromised a critical intelligence operation, Director. Major Mason's quick thinking is the only reason this officer is alive. That protocol violation you punished him for yesterday? It saved a life. Today, your refusal to break protocol would have ended one. If that officer had died, the paperwork would have been perfect, but the international incident would have cost the hospital its existence." Thorne was forced to confront the absolute truth. His rigid image-focused system was fundamentally flawed, a danger to the very lives it was designed to protect. The perfect paper trail he craved would have been the patient's death certificate. His administrative pride had cost him his authority, his respect, and almost a life of national importance. Thorne, stripped bare of his ego, walked slowly to Leo's corner. He didn't offer a defense or an apology for the firing. He simply asked, "Why did you keep that specialized kit? Why risk everything for a procedure outside your pay grade, knowing the institutional consequences?" Leo looked him squarely in the eye, his expression calm, linking his principles back to his life outside the hospital. "When I was in the field, a mistake I made, a fractional compromise in material safety, cost a young soldier his leg. I carried that failure home. That's why I came here, to work in a predictable, safe environment for Lily. But I learned that day that true stability for her doesn't come from a predictable paycheck. It comes from knowing her father won't compromise on what is right." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy, the deep trauma of his past clearly visible in his eyes. "Patients don't wait for approval, Director. You hired me for my competence, then fired me for using it. The civilian job description demands paperwork. The reality of medicine demands blood and immediate action. I will not sacrifice a life for a rule written by a lawyer." The staff watched the exchange, noting the profound shift in body language. Thorne, the pillar of the institution, was shrinking. Leo, the outcast, stood rock solid. Leo added to his previous statement, "What I do is chaos, Director, but it's controlled chaos, aimed at one target, survival. What you champion is orderly failure. I came here for silence, but the silence I found was toxic. It was the silence of fear, the fear of making a mistake on paper. You have a choice now, Elias. You can keep your immaculate records, or you can run a real hospital." The weight of Leo's words was heavier than any Navy regulation. The staff realized that Leo wasn't just negotiating his job back. He was negotiating for their freedom to save lives without the administrative guillotine hanging over their heads. The entire hospital staff watched the exchange, the most powerful man in the building listening intently to the man he had fired minutes before. They saw the director, usually an unassailable symbol of power, standing humbled and speechless. They looked at Leo not as the grease monkey tech, but as the silent, essential professional whose moral compass was stronger than the entire board of directors. Their respect was now absolute. The culture of the hospital had begun to crack under the weight of this moral truth. Dr. Julian approached Leo, not with defensiveness, but with profound professional respect, holding out his hand. "Major, thank you. I never thought to look beyond the civilian parameters. I couldn't have done it. I was waiting for permission. You were simply acting to save a life." Thorne was consumed by the terrifying irony of his own actions. He had championed a fatal administrative lie over a life-saving truth. Commander Riley confirmed the patient was stable for immediate military transfer. He gave a sharp professional salute to Leo, a gesture of respect that transcended rank, and with a final dismissive look, entirely ignored the director as he left. The massive helicopter, a symbol of necessity and Leo's true background, lifted off the roof with a final, deafening roar. The physical damage to the helipad was minor, but the damage to Thorne's system of absolute control was complete and irreversible. Director Thorne, realizing he was medically and morally bankrupt without Leo Mason's competence, found him back in his modest corner office, cleaning his old equipment. The silence was thick with unspoken truths. "Major Mason," Thorne said, his voice quiet, stripped of its former arrogance, "I am offering you immediate reinstatement as Chief of Biomedical and Emergency Logistics, with a significant pay increase. I need your judgment to vet every procedure in this hospital." Leo slowly finished wiping down a suture kit. He refused the immediate offer. "I don't need a title, Director. I need operational freedom. My condition is simple: the immediate preservation of life, based on the judgment of the attending specialist, must be legally prioritized over administrative protocol. I want a codified system that allows any qualified person to invoke a code triage override when the bureaucracy threatens a life. No more paperwork kills." It was a demand that would fundamentally restructure the hospital's core philosophy, shifting power from the auditing office to the trauma floor. Thorne, knowing he had no choice and terrified of the potential liability had the military asset died, brought the radical proposal to the hospital board. The board, cowed by the military's authoritative intervention, unanimously agreed. Leo's condition was adopted as the new Emergency Override Protocol, officially titled the Mason Mandate. In a painful public moment of humility, Thorne issued a hospital-wide memo stating that Leo Mason's prior actions were justified, necessary, and represented the new gold standard for triage. He publicly acknowledged that the adherence to procedure nearly cost the hospital its integrity and a life of national importance. Leo returned to work. He did not accept the chief title, preferring the anonymity and focus of his technical role. He remained Leo Mason, Biomed Tech, but his status had fundamentally changed. A new dedicated triage override station was built, combining the most advanced civilian diagnostics with a secure field medicine locker that only Leo and the head of trauma could access. When he spoke in a trauma bay, even Dr. Julian and the senior surgeons listened without question. He was the hospital's conscience and its ultimate, final layer of defense. The hospital's culture slowly began to change. The fear of an audit was replaced by the fear of being wrong when a life was on the line. The staff started focusing on the patient, not the paperwork. The Mason Mandate ensured that courage was rewarded, not punished. The hospital's roof was quickly repaired, but a new powerful navigation light fixture was installed on the helipad, a silent, permanent monument to the day military necessity overruled civilian hubris. Leo was back in his corner, fixing an IV pump. He finally smiled. A man at peace with his work, knowing his hands and judgment were fully valued, and that the system was now built to protect both his daughter's future and the lives of his patients. The helicopter's landing didn't just save a high-value asset, it saved the integrity of the hospital system itself. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to TT Healing Tales. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.